Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me on today's podcast. Now, there's always a lot going on in the housing market, and that's no understatement for what's been going on over the last few weeks, particularly with political party conferences having something to say on housing. They've all been at it. So to give us an update and help unpick what it all means, I'm joined again by Timothy Douglas, Head of Policy and Campaigns at Propertymark, who has indeed been at those conferences to lobby MPs on property-related matters. Timothy, thanks for joining me. How was it? How was it at those conferences? You went to them all, did you?
Yes. Hello, Phil, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. Yeah, we were at all three of the major party conferences, the Liberal Democrats down in Bournemouth, and we actually exhibited at the Labour Party conference and the Conservative Party conference this year. And, you know, the party conferences are the standout key political event in the calendar every year. I think this year, particularly important, 12 months out from a general election.
Sure.
There's no doubt about it. The Liberal Democrats had a housing debate, and it was important to their jamboree in Bournemouth. Labour were the same. The conference kicked off with Angela Rayner, the new Levelling Up or Shadow Levelling Up Secretary. So housing dominated the agenda throughout those days. For Conservatives, less so, but we got some information about funding for towns and levelling up across the country. But from Propertymark's perspective, it's very much about brand awareness and continuing our engagement with politicians. And the people that go to those conferences are obviously delegates, there's other organisations, a lot of councillors from across the country, but politicians, ministers, shadow ministers. So from our point of view, it was an opportunity to engage with them and fundamentally talk about Propertymark protection, the good things that our agents are doing. And if you use a Propertymark agent, you've got a higher level of qualification and training other than the law allows, because we're operating in an unregulated sector. And we also had a pledge for politicians to sign up for our call for all property agents to be qualified and regulated.
Excellent. Good news. Good news for everyone, particularly the consumer. Talking about pledges, there's been this government pledge to build 300,000 homes a year, and I don't even remember if ever they've made that target, but yet again they've committed to doing it. Is that realistic? I mean, why do they keep committing to it and then not delivering?
Yeah, I think the targets themselves, I think, are dreamed up by academics and the civil servants, and they'll be linked to population projections. But I think fundamentally it's never just as easy as let's build more homes. And I think there's a number of factors why governments fail to meet those targets. And it's, have we got enough qualified builders? Is the supply chain up to it? There's, as we all know, in local communities, debates and bun fights around planning. And then it's about also, are we building what's needed and what is the demand? And I think that's got to be linked to more social housing, more affordable housing, more housing for the private rent sector, more housing for people to buy. So there has been a real focus on first-time buyers, of course, over the years, but I think we need a housing strategy that builds for all, really.
But I'm intrigued because it is, as you say, very complex and there's a lot of variables. But they make it look quite simple, and then they make it look, right, we're going to build 300,000 a year, and then they never do. Well, why do they make it hard for themselves?
It's politics, of course. And politics is never, people want it to be black and white, but it's made up of grey areas. And I think ultimately the debate around brownfield, greenfield is, the prominent debate, and it flares up in different guises in different parts of the country. And I think fundamentally, threats to building on the green belt, building more houses, that tends to lead to people to object and not understand. But I think fundamentally, I think most people in their local areas don't object to new house building, but the existing residents tend to be the afterthought. They want the schools, they want the doctors, they want the roads put in first, and then to help with the existing issues, and then even newer facilities for the new houses. And I think that is where the debate butts heads with itself. But I think they're beginning to understand that, and we're looking at a more infrastructure, transport, local amenities-led planning and house building. I think that will help.
Keep my fingers and toes tightly crossed. There was lots of talk in the King's speech about planned reforms to leasehold. How quickly do you see those being implemented, and what's the state of play? Can you just expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I think these reforms are really important, and I think it's a really big announcement. It is something that Propertymark has campaigned on for several years now, and actually a research paper, our Leasehold Life Sentence report back in 2018, highlighted a lot of these issues. We've already had one piece of legislation that has banned or reduced to a zero peppercorn rate ground rents on new leases.
Good piece of legislation.
Yeah, exactly, totally. Reducing costs for consumers and making it, a more viable option to live and
it's fairer and clearer and popular.
Exactly. So I think the campaigners like ourselves and legislators and the government to give their credit have continued to look at the issue. So we're now going to hopefully in this new bill see a further extension of those reforms. So hopefully those protections will be extended to existing leaseholders, and that's really positive. I think it's really positive for the consumer because it's going to reduce costs and complications, and the longevity of these rents as they escalate over time. But it's also good for agents because it means that hopefully these properties will be simpler and easier to market and buy and sell, and people aren't exposed to additional costs.
It helps to remove doubt and uncertainty, which is the killer of deals and that kind of thing. What about Commonhold? Can you just tell us a bit about that? Where are we at?
I mean, we do have Commonhold property in this country, but it hasn't probably taken off as much as it was like. A couple of years ago, the UK government set up a Commonhold council. So, representative bodies and legal minds to look at how they can get more Commonhold onto the market. That is still ongoing, but I think it's going to take a bit more time. I mean, Commonhold itself essentially is giving, an indefinite freehold to all the unit holders in a block of flats. So it's removing, obviously, the lease. There's no lease.
Will it only apply to things that are being built now?
Well, I think there's two ways. So I think you obviously, if you're building a Commonhold block from scratch, every unit and unit holder becomes part of that Commonhold association. There's stipulations around, say, number of directors and a sort of code and ethics they can deal with in order to work out disputes. But essentially, everyone has an indefinite freehold and is part of the management of the Commonhold.
I understand that, but what happens if it's an older block that's been around for 50 years?
Yeah, so I think there is the option to convert, but obviously you've got to have a unanimous decision by all leaseholders. They've got to buy into it, and ultimately I think it will be at the behest of the freeholder as well to agree to it. So there are two options, but they're certainly available.
So in terms of the changes in the King's speech about the enfranchisement leasehold reform and ground rents and that kind of thing, how quickly do you see that actually being implemented?
Yeah, I mean, we've still got time in this Parliament, and not to get too geeky on the politics of it, but essentially we need to have a general election before January 2025. So we're into the 12-month territory of a general election being called. The rumour that it could be as late as October next year. Legislation tends to take 9 to 12 months to get through, so they still have the opportunity to do it. And it's obviously something that was in the King's speech, something that the UK government want to prioritise. We've just got to make sure that the Parliament stays and the government doesn't fall.
It's up to you, important lobbyists, you see, on behalf of us all.
Yeah, and I attended one of the parliamentary groups. There's politicians can join parliamentary groups that look at issues, and the Leasehold and Commonhold group has really grown its membership over the last couple of years. And they had a meeting actually last week on the evening of the King's speech. Right. The Housing Minister was there, and there's lots of interested parties from consumer groups to professional bodies and the legal world who want to shape this legislation, make it work, and get it on the statute book so it gives the protection for consumers and the whole housing sector going forward.
Well, let's hope so. Another really important sector that is in a bit of a state of flux at the moment is the private rented sector. There's about 5 million odd homes involved in that sector, and I feel for them. Just at the moment, there's huge demand, rents are rising, it's tough for landlords, it's tough for tenants. It doesn't feel like anyone's enjoying that at the moment. How do you read things?
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly hearing from our letting agent members, not just in England, but across the UK, that there's a demand crisis. There's a huge demand at agents' offices for private rented property. So, that is month on month, what we're seeing.
Is it going to ease? It's just getting harder and harder. There's less supply, there's more demand as the months go past.
Yeah, and I think there's a number of factors that influence landlords and activity and investment in the sector. I think those conversations are coming through to the government. They're beginning to understand the changes to the tax regime, the costs when you buy a buy-to-let property. Even like everyone is facing issues with the cost of living, and that's no different for a lot of landlords if they've got mortgages, rising costs, maintenance, etc. Unfortunately, that perhaps has gone on to rents, or it's meant that landlords don't want to invest or are de-investing and leaving the market. So it's a very precarious position. But of course, we've got legislation as well. And legislation can be a good thing, but until it arrives, can bring doubt and ambiguity. And that legislation is across the 4 nations. So landlords, I think, are looking at the future and long-term plans of their investment and being in the market and being, important housing providers, but it's becoming harder and harder, more expensive. And I think that's where the supply and the demand is meeting.
Did you get the impression that the political parties are aware of that situation or not?
I think they are aware of it. Whether there's full appetite to do something about it remains to be seen. But I think there's no doubt about it, even if you take the Renters Reform Bill, the important legislation that's going through the UK Parliament that will change the way we rent in England. At the second reading debate, lots of MPs were talking about welfare, lots of MPs were talking about tax, talking about supply issues and making sure that, housing, landlords as housing providers stay in the market, we keep the good ones, enhance them, and we get more in.
Well, one to watch because it's a really important one and it affects everyone.
Indeed.
What about local housing allowance? Is it enough? Is it too low? Where are we at?
Right. So, local housing allowance is an issue that needs to be resolved. And essentially, the local housing allowance is the housing benefit and the universal credit that people who rent receive in order to support them. The way it's worked out is that it's normally the characteristics of the household and the where they rent and the size of the property. Now, basically, the Department for Work and Pensions have created a system where these, what they give to renters is based on sort of broad rental market areas. And they use the valuation office agency in order to gather intel on the rents in those areas across the country. And Propertymark agents and letting agents across the country will feed into that. And the more that agents feed into that, we can create a more accurate picture of the cost of renting, which then goes to support local housing allowance. The problem is that over the years, the local housing allowance rates, the amount of money that I suppose the UK government is prepared to give out, has been subject to national caps and used to be based on the sort of median rent in a broad rental market area, but it's changed to be at the 30th percentile
The 30th
30th percentile of rents in an area.
Yeah.
Now, the problem is that was frozen in 2020.
Okay.
So
It doesn't look pretty, does it?
No. And, so we're still working off
Yeah.
rents and rates from a couple of years ago. And that's why organisations like ourselves and across the property sector and also consumer groups as well are calling on the UK government to reinstate that link, get the 30th percentile back as a minimum, if not raise it higher, because rents have risen in the last couple of years, but the rate that people are receiving hasn't. And therefore, there's a shortfall, there's a gap, and in certain parts of the country, it's not anywhere near market rents. And of course, if you're a landlord, looking at your increased costs as well, it's very difficult to offer your property in a very competitive market to people who are struggling. And that's why we need to see change in welfare.
Therein lies the problem, or one of many problems. What about in Scotland? Because in Scotland they've got a bit of rent control, haven't they? I don't know much about it, but I presume there were unintended consequences of legislation like that.
Well, I think the first unintended consequence was that the Scottish Government said it would be an emergency legislation. However, they've extended it the maximum times that they can extend the legislation. So it has been extended for the full 18 months into next year. So it will come to an end at the end of March 2024. The problem is, in Scotland, that legislation can't be looked at in isolation because the SNP and Green parties that are in charge of the Scottish Government, they're in administration up there, want to bring in a national system of rent control. It's in what they call the Butte House Agreement between the two parties, and that's what they're committed to. So that is shadowing this initial legislation because, of course, what's happening? Landlords are looking at the market and they're going, well, what's going to happen in the future? Am I going to be able to keep up with my costs? Am I going to be able to recoup impact of future legislation, be that energy efficiency and other measures? And therefore, it's actually artificially screwed the market.
And in terms of the industry as a whole, have we got any chance of being uniformly regulated? Because that's what we'd love.
Yeah, indeed. And that's something that Propertymark stands for and we continue to campaign for. And I think outside of Scotland, where you need a level 6 qualification as a letting agent to practice and a minimum days training course in Wales to practice as an agent, there's no statutory minimum entry requirements to work as a sales, letting, or managing agent.
Will that change?
I think we've started the journey. Everyone in the industry knows about the Regulation of Property Agents report that was done by the cross-sector group and an independent peer in the House of Lords sort of did that, and that report has been with the Housing Department since 2019. So the framework for what regulation could look like is there. The political appetite, I think there are certainly flames. At the Labour Party conference, I had some very good conversations with the shadow housing team, and they said they would look to implement the recommendations in Lord Best's report. And I think that's really important. And Labour have done a big review into the private rented sector, which will come out soon. And we're hoping that regulation of property agents will form part of that. I think for the current government, they have got quite a lot on their plate, and ultimately it's quite difficult to get regulation and new regulatory bodies into primary legislation. So I think they're very much looking at what we can amend with the existing rules and regulations in the sector. But I think we've got two opportunities still before the end of this Parliament. The leasehold legislation is massively important, and the renters reform legislation. These are two things that will impact consumers, and I think it's absolutely frightening that the government won't ensure that managing agents through building safety and leasehold reform are not qualified and regulated. Sales agents as well. Sales agents selling on a developer's site as well should be brought into that. And I think with the challenges that the renters reform and the huge change that will bring to renting in this country, we need to see qualified and regulated letting agents who can support landlords and tenants.
Couldn't agree with you more, Timothy. Good
Thank
to
you,
see you
Phil.
again. Thank you.